Directed by Peter Carter, we are talking Rituals from 1977, the same year as the original Star Wars. This was then re-released as The Creeper a few years later, and it's actually been titled Deliverance 2 in some territories as well. So Rituals is sort of like a Deliverance style movie. It focuses on 5 doctor friends who decide that they are going to go on a kind of remote wilderness trip and spend a number of days fishing out in the middle of nowhere. They're dropped off by aquaplane and are left going to be picked up some days later. However, they are seemingly stalked by an unknown figure who first of all steals their boots and then basically harasses them, and resulting in deaths and well, some mutilation. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. So this is a sort of gritty style of Backwoods slasher style movie. What do I think works in this one? I think the biggest plus in this one is the acting and the kind of the characterization. So we have a group of kind of middle-aged doctors, or sort of young middle-aged doctors. So they're all kind of like grown adults. They're all professionals. They've been friends for years. And they're obviously all kind of quite smart individuals, the fact that they're all doctors. So this isn't kind of like teens being chased around in the woods. These are, you know, maybe not survivalists, but certainly sort of smart men. And I got to say, I do think the way these characters are portrayed by our actors is very grounded. I actually do think they do it. Everyone here does a good job, and just the kind of like the incidental sort of dialogue a lot of the time, the way these kind of characters are talking a lot of the time is about medical procedures and things like this. Just this kind of this dialogue between the characters seems very sort of genuine. So you kind of do get the idea that these characters are all friends, they are all doctors, and they come across as such. So that's what I all quite liked. And also, the movie still gives us some differences between these sort of characters in regard to their kind of personality. So even though they have all maybe somewhat of a similar background, they still have a sort of distinctness about them. So the character work here, I do think is very strong. The movie also is a lot kind of shot on location, and this kind of benefits from this sense of isolation and against the kind of the elements and stuff here. And it's as much about just surviving in the wilderness with kind of dwindling supplies as they end up, as I say, losing their boots. They're having to kind of like use makeshift kind of footwear. Supplies kind of end up kind of getting washed away, things like this. So, and then obviously there's injured parties among them. So it's all sort of like a gradual escalation in regards to the kind of the stakes here. And then obviously when they realise that there is actually someone out there, I think there's an interesting sort of twist in regards to the motivations. They although they are, you know, arguably you could say a Backwoods kind of slasher type, this character or characters do have a specific reason why they may be targeting these doctors. Now that is a double-edged sword. I am going to come back to that, but it gives us that there's some context and some backstory in regards to this mysterious figure or figures in the woods. The movie, I think, is you know, it has these escalating stakes as the film kind of goes through, so you are interested. I do think, transiting to what doesn't work, as the movie kind of goes on, I think maybe the interest starts to wane a little bit. Actually, it really doesn't. It feels at one point, I have to say, where it sort of ends up treading water a little bit. I do think that there are some elements here where I think are characters, they're acted well, and the characterization is good, but I do think some of the writing is a little on the weaker side. For example, it ends up being a little bit Lord of the Flies at some point, where some of the characters turn on each other. And I'm not saying this wouldn't happen, but it just seems to be a little bit too severe, I think, considering, again, these are, you know, friends who have known each other for a long time. It's not really no one's fault. These are smart men, you know, these are, you know, people who have studied and become doctors and stuff, and I think sometimes they end up being written in a way so the plot can happen, really, rather than a kind of a realistic depiction of what people might actually do. Because to me, I think if you were, and again, these aren't survivalists, these aren't wilderness enthusiasts necessarily, but they're smart people, logical people. And I do think sometimes their actions seem a little illogical and a little bit too sort of fraught. Now, I'm not saying these people would certainly be under some stress, but I think the way that it goes as depicted in the movie, I think is a little bit unrealistic, because it wants us the plot to go in a certain direction, to be honest. So that's my issue with that. I think maybe the movie just isn't quite as interesting as movies like Deliverance or maybe Southern Comfort, which I think are the two sort of movies that you can probably easily be compared to. It's still, I think, an interesting movie. It just doesn't quite have maybe as much going on, as much personality or charisma as this. And the other thing I would say is, I think this movie, and some would argue maybe this isn't the movie's fault, but from what I understand, there were some technical issues whilst in post-production with this one, and as such, the final act of this movie is very dark, and what I mean is low light. So it's incredibly hard to see what's kind of going on. And there have been some attempts to restore this movie and improve this, but generally speaking, it is what it is. We have to look at the movie that we've got rather than what it could have been. So I do think there is some kind of technical issues here where it's just extremely kind of low light and difficult to see what's kind of going on. And then I suppose the final thing I have to say is to do with this killer. As I said, that there's an attempt here to kind of make him sort of tangentially related as to why he's targeting these doctors specifically. But that seems like a massive coincidence. There just happens to be these doctors, and this guy has a vendetta against doctors. It just seems like, well, I mean, how do you even know, to be honest? But so yeah, I think that again, it's the writing is a little bit on the weaker side, perhaps. But overall, it's a decent movie. I don't think it's quite as classic as I say, maybe Deliverance or, you know, or Southern Comforts and movies like that. But it's not a bad film, an above average film, but maybe not a classic. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. What were your thoughts and views on it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.